Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren. I am the chief economist at American Compass. And this week we are talking with Amber Lapp, research fellow at the Institute for Family Studies, a stay-at-home mom in southwestern Ohio, where she continues her research, and author of a fantastic feature for Commonplace last week called America's Missing Men. That went behind the data and the depths of despair to look at the actual profiles of young men on her own street and what she has seen happening to people. It is a powerful and deeply affecting piece. And as soon as I read it, I sent her an email and said, now we have to record a podcast and you get to listen. So stay tuned for that conversation. And of course, go read the full piece either right before or right after. But let me also tell you about some other stuff at Commonplace. Obviously, it is, I don't know if we can call it Liberation Week now that Liberation Day is past, but happy liberation to those who celebrate. We've had a couple of great immediate responses to the Trump administration announcements, and also want to highlight a really interesting piece from the beginning of the week by EPPC's Claire Morell called Passing the Point of Resistance, on how school cell phone bans, once they're actually implemented, change the minds of parents and their kids about the importance of doing just that. So take a look at all of that, and then look forward to next week. We'll have a broader symposium rounding up all of the best thinking and commentary on what to make of the Trump administration's tariff policy, broader trade policy, broader foreign policy. And so we are really looking forward to bringing all of that to you. Last but not least, of course, Understanding America. We had a special extra Understanding America in the Substack this week to highlight my appearance on the Daily Show with Jon Stewart on Monday. That was an incredible experience. Had a really interesting and long conversation with Jon. We went for about half an hour and they ran the whole thing. So highly recommend checking that out on YouTube. You can find it in my Twitter account and on the Substack. And if you are not already subscribing, understandingamerica.co awaits your click. But without further ado, here is Amber Lapp. Amber Lapp, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I am thrilled to have this chance to talk with you. We've just published one of my favorite pieces we have run since launching Commonplace that you wrote called America's Missing Men. That is just really striking profile of the realities for a lot of people behind some of the statistics that get focused on these days. And so I have a ton of questions about, more than anything, what you make of your own work and see as the takeaways. But wanted to start a little bit broader. I think, a lot of our audience is certainly very familiar with your writing for American Compass and Commonplace. But tell us a little bit more about yourself and your background. What brought you to doing this kind of work?
Well, sure. In 2010, my husband David and I were, I was teaching high school. My husband David was working at a think tank in New York City called the Institute for American Values. And they were, it was the time when there was a lot of talk about the marriage gap. Charles Murray's book had come out, and David Blankenhorn, the president of IAV, had asked my husband David if we knew anybody that would be interested in going to Ohio or a small town somewhere in the middle of the country to interview working class young adults about their stories of forming families, relationships, to kind of try to understand the stories behind the stats of this marriage gap, that trends in divorce and childbearing and marriage were bifurcating along class lines like so much else in our society. And I was sitting there with my stack of papers, grading, and I was like, we would like to do that. And so that's how it all started. But it was originally going to be a summer project for the summer of 2010. And so David and I had kind of an advisory team and put together kind of our methods for how we were going to find our sample, which included going door to door. We had a list that was generated randomly, and we just spent the first part of our summer knocking on doors in this town in southwestern Ohio, which is not too far from where I grew up. And so this was part of our selection of this town because I had been aware that the geography of the place is that there's a valley. It's the oldest town in our county. And then there's a hill, and on the hill there's a lot of new development separated by a forest and a river and an old railroad track that has now become a bike trail. And so just in terms of like the class divide, you even see it in the geography of the place, which I know is not really that uncommon. But so yeah, we started talking to people, but these interviews, how do I even find the words for it? It we came into this thinking, okay, maybe young adults don't really believe in marriage anymore. Maybe there are differences here along class lines about beliefs. But then we started hearing these stories that were just like heart-wrenching about trauma and addiction and just like deep suffering. And needless to say, that kind of changed the trajectory of our life. And we came back the next summer to do follow-up interviews. And then eventually in 2012, so 2 years after that initial summer, decided to move to the town. And we've been here ever since. And that's our work here has looked different stages.
And it is such important work that anyone who listens to the podcast knows I don't just tell my guests they're all doing very important work, but this is such important work. I think I remember we first met it must have been a panel discussion at AEI in 2016, 2015 maybe. And I just remember listening to the other people on the panel and then you and thinking, this is so much better than what than what everybody else is thinking. I'm really blown away, and I think what it traces back to is there's no shortage of people, obviously, both in journalism and in think tank work, who are going on junkets to various places around the country, and meeting with the people at the round table who share their stories, or going to the diner and interviewing somebody. And I think that's better than nothing, but it also somewhat rightfully gets lampooned at times as a sort of safari type of journalism. And as your essay makes clear as an example, you're not writing about people you sort of accost and talk to for 10 minutes. You're writing about people in your community who you know and who are sort of part of the fabric of your own life. And that gives an entirely different dimension to the work. I wonder, is it also harder though? I mean, how do you deal with the question of sort of, are you just talking to your friends? Are you talking to your subjects? What gets written about? What doesn't get written about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I think that's always this ongoing question. And there are, of course, limitations with that perspective, but I do think that because of all that you just said, there's also something really valuable. But yeah, like for this piece in particular, the Logan, for example, it was like, I hadn't been some of these conversations that I'm reporting on are not conversations that happened because I was interviewing somebody for a piece. And so then there's the kind of follow up of going back and saying, hey, do you mind? I mean, most of my neighbors know that I also write, and it's like, do you mind if I write about this, and kind of talking about that. So it's kind of messy, and I don't necessarily, I welcome other people's thoughts about that. Honestly, it's something I feel like I'm always trying to navigate. But I do think that one thing that is there's like a perspective that comes over time, and in a lot of ways, like, I'm mostly a stay-at-home mom with our 6 kids. So my work hours technically are very limited. But I have been kind of amazed to see that over time, if you're just in a place and even being a very like mediocre kind of neighbor who's just, occasionally waving at the person next door as you're walking into your house, even that has this great value of the kind of trust that's built over time, just with familiarity and the kinds of, I think that I would not have written this piece obviously without feeling a part of this place. And the idea for the piece had come about, again, this is, not some scientific sample, but just thinking like, wow, it's odd that even just with, the like 6 houses that I could draw a circle around here, that are closest to me. Like, what are the stories of the men in those houses? And just this little microcosm of larger trends, being able to kind of really go deep into that.
Yeah, and so the piece for those who didn't read it yet but are now going to go read it is this really powerful set of profiles of these individuals and families that is exceptionally light touch on the conclusion drawing. It is sort of the ultimate show don't tell, that I think really effectively certainly conveys some of what you see as meaningful about it, but also really leaves a lot to the reader to kind of draw their own conclusions and think about how stories like these fit into their own assumptions and perspective on things. So I wanted to push you more on what your what your perspectives are, and sort of as you thought about why you wanted to do this piece, what you wanted people to take away from it. What was at the top of your mind?
Well, I kind of struggled. I told a few friends I was working on it, and whenever I tried to summarize the piece, I didn't really have anything to say beyond, I'm writing something about the men on my street. And it was like, I don't really have like an agenda here or a larger point to make. I mean, obviously, ultimately, I would like for us as a society to be able to have some sort of like understanding of what is happening here that seems so mysterious, and I think different than other times. Although, I mean, humans are humans for all time, but so ultimately, my hope is that we would take seriously these struggles and not ignore them, and then try to understand like what are the sources of hope, like what is the pathway here. As time has gone on, there are some things I've become less certain of, and other things that I feel more hopeful about.
That's interesting. What have you become less certain about?
Okay, one thing I became less certain about is that when we went into this research, I am a research fellow at the Institute for Family Studies. I'm very pro-marriage. I have seen I believe in the good of marriage. And yet I think one thing that I have become less certain about as time has gone on is that a message to people of, I even hesitate to say this because I am not against having pro-marriage messages in our culture, but I think I've become less certain about the efficacy of that because marriage, because there so many of the people that I've interviewed, they very much want to marry. They very much want to have family, a partnership and family that is long lasting. But this doesn't seem to be like reduced to a simple personal choice. And so I guess I've become less certain about some things that are like just focused on like the cultural aspect of encouraging marriage, and more interested in like what does that like marriage ecosystem, if you will, like what are all the essential elements of that, and wanting to have this like multi-pronged approach, which I'm sure even people who would be very much in favor of recreating a strong marriage culture like wouldn't be opposed to that. But.
Right. No, it's a great example of something I've found myself thinking about a lot, especially in the context of conservatism and how conservatives approach a lot of these questions, because it's sort of the quintessential example where I think the conservative message has been for a long time, well, this is just a choice and people should make better choices and we should tell them to make better choices. And on the flip side, you also have a lot of people who now say, well, if people aren't getting married, clearly that's just their choice. And that must be because that's not what they want. And what strikes me about that is that point of view is like literally the least conservative thing ever. I mean, if, without getting into a lot of navel gazing about what conservatism truly is, it seems to me obvious that folks who bring a conservative point of view to both kind of defining human flourishing, understanding the importance of community and so forth, more than anything recognize that people aren't these autonomous free agents optimizing, every moment of their lives. They are sort of people who are formed by the conditions around them and heavily influenced by that, and that the choices they make are going to be a function of that. And you see that in some cases, right? When talking about the problems of broken homes and the challenges of growing up in a broken home, everyone, conservatives are very comfortable saying, well, obviously that puts an individual at all sorts of disadvantages and it's therefore a bad thing. But they then turn around and take that individual and say, well, but now all he has to do is make better choices and everything will be fine. And so I think what you're saying strikes me as exactly right, that we, of course, want a positive message about what good decisions look like, but treating it as simply a matter of making the better decision doesn't really speak at all to what people are dealing with, and in some ways can really therefore lose the kind of credibility of the message.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's this really deep struggle, which is in the piece I talk about when I talk about this phrase, chasing demons. But so many times I hear people say, I don't want to do what my parents did. I want to give my kids their mom and their dad. Just this like fierce resolve. A lot of times even like, we're not going to get married right away because we don't want to divorce, because we don't want to put our kids through that. And so we're going to, you can say this is misguided, but the intention there is like, we value marriage. And so we're going to delay marriage to make sure we've got this right. We're not going to rush it. And, but anyways, there's this like really deep struggle of like not being able to, even if you want something and will it, like not being able to make it a reality, it not following from your own desires. And that seems to be this sort of like really deep turmoil that I see at the root of a lot of these problems.
Yeah, and another thing that comes through the stories is that there's a weird sort of internal circle to the challenge. But I'm not saying that well, but what I mean by it is that a lot of people think about something like, the marriage issue and focus it very much on, okay, what does that mean for kind of families and raising kids and so forth. But it also flows back the other direction, that not being married or not having access to that sort of structure then has incredible consequences for the individual who is not benefiting from the institution. Mm-hmm. And again, that doesn't lead to an easy answer of like, well, then just get married and you won't have that problem. It's a situation where I think as you put it, the sort of lack of constraints and sort of forming around the individuals that in turn leaves them unable to go out and find those things. Mm-hmm. And so I guess what I was, as preparing for this conversation, kind of making a list of like, okay, what are all of the different places where this is breaking down? And you've got, so first of all, tell me if this is a good list or if okay. I'm missing any. But if you sort of almost move through the life cycle, there is sort of the initial family structure in which people are growing up themselves. There is an education system that I think, especially for boys, is not serving them especially well. There's a broader culture that doesn't seem to be creating a lot of very good messages, generally speaking, about what does and doesn't matter and what to focus on. There is the lack of sort of coming of age institutions. And we did a really interesting conversation with Sam Pressler about what he calls the adult transition and how, communities used to have all of these formal mechanisms to help young people become adults. And today we just have college, and that's fine if you go to college, but if you don't, then we just sort of have nothing. You kind of just float off, float off into the ether, and you're supposed to figure it out. And then we have the sort of more economic challenges that we see as people move into adulthood, and the lack of kind of opportunity for stable jobs that would let people support families and so forth. So that was my list. Is anything you would add to or amend?
Yeah, that seems pretty comprehensive. One part of, the adult transition is that transition to marriage. I know something I hear quite a bit is, oh, we don't really know many people who are married. I remember one young woman saying to me, like, it would just be really nice to be able to like sit down with a married couple and talk to them about what that means. And so, that's one piece of that transition when we don't have models or mentors, that matters. But about or go ahead.
Yeah, well, no, that's interesting, and because that is another good maybe example, is that it seems to me that as our society is bifurcated so much along this kind of class line, that you also therefore don't have communities where people looking for role models also are in contact with and can find the role models. Mm-hmm. Some people say that's sort of a nostalgic past, but as someone from the same area where you are now, does that feel like something that's changed? Did there used to be more sort of cross, what's the word?
Well,
Not cross contamination, but cross communication. Yeah.
No, it's one of the things I find really interesting about the history of our street. Because there are many older couples that live here who have been here for about 50 years, and our house doesn't have just one kind. I mean, our street doesn't have just one kind of house. Like I'm in a 1948 Cape Cod, but a couple houses across the street down, there's this like beautiful, and I don't know enough about architecture to know what kind of house it is, but it's like large and it just looks very grand, and was built in the late 1800s. And my understanding is that the town doctor lived in that house, and I mean you can tell it's more grand than the other houses, and yet it was built right here with everybody, with all the other houses, and just from conversations with some of the people who've been here for a long time, I do think there has been a change in the kind of, it even has been a source of contention with like where the village hall is, and where the elementary school is. The old elementary school is right here in town, so everybody in town can walk to it, and same with the city hall. And the elementary school has since moved up the hill to where the new developments are. We had to kind of fight to keep the town hall down here, but I don't know. That's just to say that there is something about this geography of separation that does seem to matter for relationships, because again, like it doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but in my experience, it has made a big deal to live next door to someone, even with like practical needs. Like there have been times when there's a neighbor who like is searching for a car or something like that, and like I've been able to connect them to somebody on the hill, so to speak. But if I wasn't living here, I would never know about that need.
Yeah. There are a whole bunch of factors then. Are there some that you put at the top of the list that if you'd say, either this is the biggest problem, or if there were one thing that you could change, where you think we should start, or where you think we should focus?
Well, the thing that stands out to me, which can come across as a little cliche, but I do think it's the thing that people, when they're narrating their own stories, it's usually the thing that looms most largely. And that really is like the family of origin story. So, for example, when I was interviewing Sue, Ricky's mom, who in the piece is the young man who used to live across the street from me who committed suicide in September. I had been preparing in my mind a list of questions, and most of them kind of centered around like, what was his work life like? And, like thinking a lot about these like adult sort of institutions and his either connection or disconnection to them. But the first thing that she said when she sat down in my living room and started to tell the story is that uh, um, Ricky's dad rejected him. And she talked about how their relationship had not lasted long. And then Ricky, when he was, I believe, a young teen, his dad was actually in prison at that time. And he had been like wanting a relationship with him. But his dad specifically wrote him a letter saying, I don't want to have anything to do with you. And so for that story, that the absence of that relationship, sort of the way that, and I obviously can't ask Ricky about it, so I don't know what he would say, but I have talked to a lot of other young men and women who often kind of tell their whole life story in the frame of what happened to them in childhood. And so I think that's part of what is so tricky about this is thinking, I see like a really deep desire on the part of those young adults to not repeat the cycle. But it's very demoralizing for them when they find themselves repeating the cycle. Yeah. And this is also where the question of like mental health and moral responsibility and sort of like what is the relationship there? How does this? Yeah, it's just kind of a mysterious thing to me.
When you mentioned young women, which isn't the focus of this particular essay, and also I would say strikingly in general is a much less of a focus for anyone these days, at least in this sort of space. But they are half of are half of the population. If you'd been writing about young women, my guess is it would be very different. How would that look? What are the differences, and what would you attribute that to?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was thinking about that a little bit because a hesitation I had in the back of my mind with this piece is like, oh, I really hope that this doesn't come across as political. Like, I don't want it to be politicized because I'm not very online, so I don't know a lot about this conversation, but what I do see a conversation about masculinity often is very off-putting to me in terms of just the way that it pits the sexes against one another. And anyway, so it's just like I'm not writing this out of some like agenda here, but also for me, and then I was thinking about how this dynamic that I talk about of like the desire for interior freedom and how I see that as at the root of a lot of this. I mean, that is something that's just a human desire. It's not specific to men. But for whatever reason in our current moment, we do have data that men are struggling more with, like they are affected more. But there are also lots of examples of young women who I know who have similar struggles, like Ricky's sister even. She is she is still here with us, so that's an important difference. But she's in a recovery program. And so I just ran into Sue at the grocery store a couple nights ago, and she was just coming back from a ceremony at this recovery program. And so Ricky's little sister is doing well, and she's, been sober for a certain amount of time. And they had some ceremony with rocks that they were giving to a person who meant a lot to them in their life. And but so it's not to say that women aren't subject to a lot of these same struggles. And also, like for me personally, writing this piece, like I've had my own challenges with mental health, and so like actually the Man's Search for Meaning at the end was recommended to me by a couple young male friends because I was like searching for something to read for myself. And so there is like a sense in which I feel like I as a woman like share in this sort of search for interior freedom. And yet, I don't know, it was a question in my mind coming into this conversation is like, what are the differences and why do those differences exist?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting your point that you're sort of not very online, which comes through in the piece, particularly, and I'm curious whether its absence was intentional or not. A lot of the very online discussion about these things focuses on like the new generation of male influencers and people who are trying, they are seen as trying to sort of fill the void in positive male role models by providing a series of role models that seem not to be very positive at all in a lot of ways. None of that shows up in the piece. And I'm curious if you sort of in your day-to-day life, in their day-to-day lives, see that as relevant or not really on the radar for people and something that's happening off in the Twitter sphere.
Yeah. I thought about it like, oh, should I like delve into that world in order to make some sort of connection? But I was like, well, nobody that I talked to brought up any of those influencers, and they're not. I think I'm just gonna let it rest because I don't have the time right now to look into that and to try to make connections. So, yeah, that's why that was absent.
Yeah, but so it's not something that was coming up from others. It's not something you see out there a lot right now.
I mean, I don't actually know, but at least in this small group of people that is represented in this article, it wasn't anything
that's interesting.
that came up.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, the last thing I wanted to ask you about was the interior freedom point, which I thought was a really powerful framing at the end. And it raises in my mind a really important political issue, which I think this will be a healthy politicization, not an unhealthy politicization
I welcome
of the
that.
topic.
Yeah.
But you tell me. One thing that I'm always very cognizant of is that, I think there's a lot of, or certainly a growing awareness of these kinds of challenges and the distinction between the sort of classical American personal liberty framing of everything and the actual reality and need of this interior freedom, which can actually be in tension with just celebrating personal liberty all the time. And yet in our political culture, it seems to me that there is still an overwhelming focus on the personal liberty. We find, particularly in our polling, you see the sort of quintessential working class moving to the right of center, if anything, becoming sort of more committed to the personal liberty narrative, wanting less involvement of government, et cetera. Which, from one perspective, you could say, maybe that is the path forward, but in a lot of ways is very inconsistent with messages that, folks like someone like Senator Josh Hawley, someone like Vice President J.D. Vance seems to be trying to convey. And so I guess a two-part question. Part one is about how you think people themselves perceive that message and that set of trade-offs. And then we can come back to part two, which is about what is the right way to talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't know if I know enough to say. On the interior freedom point, it's like, my observation is that, we can have all the freedom in the world. And yet if we are not able to like make the choices that we want to make in that vacuum, like without the right supports, like basically I feel like we've had this experiment of like, if you have all the freedom in the world, are you able to like act to make the choices that you want to make and like actualize the things that you say are most important to you? And I think that that's like the frustration that I hear when people have this common lament of like, what's going on nowadays, or this like talk of like the old world, or this like nostalgic longing for in my grandparents' days. You see this a lot with a figure like Oliver Anthony, who is very popular among people I know. Um, just a lot of times people will say, I have an old soul, like I wasn't meant for this time. Like there's this sense, but I think that a lot of times that goes hand in hand with this idea that the government is involved in kind of the reason we don't have that old world might be
Yeah.
because of government involvement and a loss of our personal freedoms. And so, yeah, even though that's not the way that I would see it, I think that is kind of the way that, at least the way I usually see it
Yeah.
articulated.
No, that makes sense, I guess. So to make it concrete in terms of, for people who are trying to advance these kinds of arguments and make the case that we do need to change, whether, from a policy perspective, from a cultural perspective,
Hmm.
even how we, do understand freedom and liberty and so forth. I mean, like a very tactical example that comes to mind that I find fascinating is the increasing discussion about online sports betting, where it is young men who are sort of disproportionately harmed, to the extent that you have people who are being harmed by the way it's promoted and so forth. But if you poll people on what they think of it, the idea that, well, maybe we shouldn't, maybe we should just go back to banning it, remains extremely unpopular for the most
Hmm.
part.
Hmm.
And so whether it's in that context or just more broadly, I wonder, like, whether you've heard it talked about, or if you had to sort of talk about it, you know, what would you say to people? How would you sort of describe the case that maybe we would be better off if we actually accepted kind of some more constraints on things?
That's a really good question.
Or maybe it's a
Yeah.
totally lost cause.
I don't think it's a lost cause. I just don't know if my brain will be able to it's like it's a really um when I'm thinking about solutions, this is something I come back to a lot, is the idea that um some of the things that I think might help might not be that popular
Mm-hmm.
if you're thinking of a very limited role for government. And I don't have any breakthroughs about the insights about messaging. I'm sorry. I wish that I did right now, but it's something I should think about more.
I was going to
Yeah,
say we will assign you to write on this topic,
there you go.
as you do. I guess last question then would actually be, you mentioned you thinking about things that you think would help, and some of them do have a policy component, or a role for government. What are a couple of those? What's on your list?
Mhm. Yeah. Um, well, I think that something I do hear from people, and that I think just affects daily life, is uh, conditions in the workplace. So, um, my the one young man that I write about in the piece, Logan, he was laid off last year from his work at in manufacturing, and then was unemployed for a few months, and was just um, he talks a lot about how his dad has had a union job for 30 years, and he just sees this like stability there that his life has not had. So currently he's working as a custodian, and his hours are 4 a.m. to 4 p.m. And he's, I think, feels like he hasn't, I don't know, he seems to point a lot to this like sense of kind of like a precariousness that affects him. So I think, you guys at American Compass have done a lot to think about labor and what might it look like to have more worker power. I was talking to somebody else recently who was talking about the scheduling piece and just the way, because this is another one of Logan's complaints, is that he often feels like he's like on call or having to, go in at weird times to do weird things, but like isn't compensated for that. And another neighbor of mine who is a Amazon driver has kind of a similar sense. I think his hours are typically like 9:30 till about 8:30 at night, and so like to see his son is like kind of hard to figure out. And anyway, there's people will talk about like feeling like they don't have time for anything else because work kind of like takes up their entire life. And not that necessarily they're working even that long of hours, but like the way that the work is parsed. And like
that's last week's episode was with David Otter, the economist who does the China shock research, and he was actually making this exact point. We were talking about the sort of change in jobs that occurs when manufacturing goes away. He was very hesitant to use qualitative terms like better jobs, worse jobs, but he said that, in quantitative terms, a huge difference is, yes, the jobs that come after the manufacturing jobs tend to pay somewhat lower wages, but at least as problematic is this exact point about the precarity. And that one nice thing about the manufacturing sector and just the way it operates is you can give people regular 9-to-5 jobs, or if they're on another shift, it's a regular shift and it's contained in the hours and it's the same hours every time. And that is a really important dimension that I think, you can try to kind of put a value on it, but to your point, it permeates outward into lives in a lot of other ways too.
Yeah, because I do think I wish that I felt more excited about like, oh, there are all of these policy things we could do and this would solve the problem. And, mostly I feel like, there's all this like deeply personal and relational work that we have to do and somehow figure out. And like, maybe it would be great if like everybody, like if we could figure out health insurance so that everyone could have health insurance and take care of themselves. And like if counseling was and like rehab programs could be covered because that's just something that, there are a lot of people that don't have that and don't have access to that. It feels really difficult to get into a program like that. So even if you're at the moment where you're like, oh, I need help and I need to get it, it's not like it's easy to do that. But anyways, what I was saying though is that even having the space to do that kind of work, and then also in the civil society sphere, like we're not just spirits, like we're material beings also. And so the realities of your work life and the conditions and the schedule that you have, like this really diminishes civil society if we don't have kind of arrangement in our work lives.
Yeah. Well, we will have to have you back on after you write your epic essay for us on reconciling the American tradition of folk libertarianism to the needs of more robust policy to address interior freedom. But until then, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Oren.
And we will be back again soon with another episode of the American Compass podcast.